This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley, Ruxton by Philip Verrill Mighels. Chapter 9. Revelations in a Runaway. More furiously than ever before had James trailed that afternoon. Never had a day been finer, the assemblage of carriages and riders in the park more brilliant, or Thurley more alive with the effervescence of youth and the fire of joy. Her horse, a superb Arabian, glossy as the sun itself and darkly red as the richest autumn foliage, was ignited by her spirit. He pranced, cavorted, arched his neck in pride of the dainty mistress on his back, and ached for a chance to let out his powers for once and prove himself worthy of her love. Already she loved him in a riotous mood that extended to the ruddy world in its regal splendours of colour. Not since a day in the far-away spring had she been thus enthroned in a saddle. Her spirit vaulted tempestuously ahead of the galloping steed. He gloried in the rush and motion, the exhilarating air with its touch of frost hurled upon her by her cleaving through the new-found avenues of pleasure. She rode like a splendid young Valkyrie, wielded by skill and sheer abandon into wondrous unity with the animal, excited and delighted by her weight. It was only wild riding in the sense of its utter freedom, beauty, and spontaneity. It was rhythm and spirit and courage exemplified in her absolute confidence and passion for living and motion. She dashed through one of the bridle paths that parallel a drive like a vision of velocity and beauty. From 100 glinting carriages flinging back the sun rays from varnish, silver, and burnished animals, a wondering procession of wealth's spoiled darlings paid her the tribute of their stares, their gasps, curiosity, and admiration. Some for the marvel of her colouring and grace, the proud, handsome face exquisitely regal; some for such horsemanship as the park had rarely seen, and some for her daring and apparent recklessness. The men and women drifting by on the tide of luxury and ease were magnetized despite themselves, while Thurley was completely unaware. She raced from their sight like a fragment from an epic of rapture. Her joy and her Amazonian liberty and flight was a thing to be felt by all who saw, so potent were its radiant emanations. Round the bend, with James in desperation spurring at the rear, she encountered a party of equestrians, men and women, posting along like a dozen conventional automatons, invented for mechanical riding. With one accord they turned to watch her pass. Beyond them she approached and overtook 3 women riding in a group. The farther she rode, the sweeter grew the breath that swept from the autumn-perfumed trees, and the wilder became the answer of her spirit. It seemed like a ride through amber, gold, and flame. Every vista looming ahead in her path seemed a red-lit glow of welcome. Then the way once more drew in abreast a drive, where again the pageantry of wealth rolled languorously by. Broughams, coupés, glinting automobiles, hansoms, barouches, and children's phaetons, decorously winding the highways of indulgence, and flinging off their largesse of light from 1,000 flashing spokes, moved in 2 opposing streams. Again, as before, the homage of their seldom stirred attention was paid to Thurley, romping past. 100 scions of the house of Ease inquired who she was. Then, from one of the carriages occupied solely by one old woman and a broad, athletic young man, came a note of surprise and gladness, which started as if to become a shout and ended much suppressed. The eager young man half rose in his seat, showing his arm in a sling. It was Ruxton Stuyvesant, once more desperately hoping for the vision of a face which at last he had seen once again. He saw her skimming lightly by, with never a turn of her head, her thoroughbred tingle with his glad response to the beating and wish of her heart. He wanted to cry out mightily, to turn and pursue, to halt her somewhere, anywhere, for a moment of looking in her eyes. She was gone almost before his thoughts could arrange themselves in order. Stifling an utterance akin to a groan, he sank once more on the cushions, and instantly recovered sufficient of his natural acumen to gaze out again for Thurley's attendant. "Great roaring ghosts!" he exclaimed aloud as James went feverishly past. He had recognised Alice's man. A mad, unreasoning impulse to escape his present obligations with the quiet old woman at his side and hasten pell-mell to the Van Kirk mansion was the initial suggestion in his brain. Then he knew that no one would be found at home, and could only hope that Thurley might cross his orbit again. It seemed likely that she would cross every orbit in the world, while for herself it was merely the wine of unbridled delight that increased in her nature as she rode. With the horse it was madness that was growing. He, too, was aflame with the love of speed, the tang of nude nature in the air, the urging of joy-heated blood. She slowed him at the crossing of a pedestrian's path, and he quivered with impatience to be off again, to delight alike the kindred spirit on his back and the riot in his veins. She lifted the reins, and he was swiftly galloping, dipping to earth like a swallow. They were headed south, the park's length northward as far as the riding pathway went, and the width of it westward had been rapidly traversed. They would be obliged to make its round a half-dozen times to satisfy Thurley's craving for the joy. The gravelled way swung close to the side of the western drive, where only a few of the chariots of wealth and fashion paraded. A number of rapidly moving automobiles were here, almost entirely in possession of the road. It was near the spot where Ruxton Stuyvesant had fallen in the rain, and Thurley had been launched by kindly fates. A racing car came swiftly down the stretch, its reckless driver wilfully and wantonly shattering the most liberal of the speed regulations. Abreast of Thurley's Arabian, already strung to the highest nervous tension, the fellow suddenly opened his muffler cut-out, and his great motor roared with deafening percussions. Instantly bolting after one wild leap aside, the animal under Thurley flattened oddly down above the earth, already streaming greyly away beneath him, and ran with all his might. His speed was terrific, not in the motion, which had steadied to a strangely easy undulation, but because of the bite of impinging air, the dizzying chaos of trees and park features stampeding by in confusion, and the scene of lost mastery lodged in the girl's delighted being but a moment earlier. She knew she was helpless to control the passion of the thoroughbred, whose bone and sinew and fiery blood had burned for this moment of delirium. She was not alarmed. The sensation engendered by the madness of speed aroused a new sort of pleasure, a welcoming to recklessness, almost a wish for still more velocity forward. She knew she could not ride like this for long without gravest dangers. There were dangers alike to herself and to everything near her. She gathered the reins more closely in and applied all the strength of her fine young arms to break his mad flight with the bit, but the bar of steel was clamped in his teeth, where resistance only whetted him the more. A shout went up from someone in the road. It swept like a roar, like a wail. Ahead was a turn of the bridle path, and beyond it she knew not what. More yells and shouts came weirdly through the air that was storming, roaring by. The horse responded, if possible, with added speed. Rocks, a bridge, a group of people walking, who barely reeled back from the animal's course in time to escape his flying hoofs, made a series of blurs in the panoramic rush that the path's two sides had become. Pale with the chill of biting air, and likewise with her cool comprehension of the menace of every movement, Thurley felt the inward lean as the flight-crazed Arabian took the curve and plunged on in something akin to panic, rapidly succeeding all things else that might have been present in his nature before. Then her heart turned over like a helpless bell swung too far out of its balance. The road was almost wholly occupied by 10 or more riders, women and men, walking their mounts in the same direction she was racing. She could not cry out a warning. In a blinding conviction of disaster, she could only tug with sturdier might at the reins already tight as fiddle strings, and hope to steer for a foot-wide space between the nearest riders. But someone screamed, some woman sitting on an iron bench that overlooked the scene. In utter fright, the riders scattered right and left to let the comet through. Then 2 of the men, well mounted and cool, spurred hotly in pursuit. They were joined 100 yards below by a mounted policeman, who swung forth already at speed before Thurley had won to his post. He and the men from the pleasure group fell behind with the trees and rocks and wind as the thoroughbred warmed to his work. By then the cries from a score of throats had alarmed the park for a mile. The fright and excitement increased apace as 4 mad riders hurtled on, thoroughly white and rigid, in the lead. James had been hopelessly outdistanced in the first few hundred yards. Hoof-beat and screams that pierced the air sounded mad warnings down the course. The bridle path dived beneath a bridge that spanned the western drive of Fashion. 100 frightened women saw the runaway dynamic of power flashing his muscles like engine parts in the sunlight's streaming rays, with the stiff, upright figure of the white-faced girl unflinchingly applying strength and nerve and courage to the task of subduing his madness. A second and third of the mounted police whipped into the vortex at the curve that swung on the pathway's eastward trend. Over, across to the dangerous junction of riders' path and driveway shot the eager horse, intent upon besting the animals in pursuit. But past the policeman and past his companion crept one of the men from the group in the rear, slowly but steadily gaining on the hard-breathing bay that Thurley guided, and she, in the meantime, finally provoked into new resolve to snatch back the mastery tautly held before, lost patience with the senseless horse, and with it all comprehension of her danger. "Boy," she said, "behave yourself. You ought to be ashamed." Abruptly losing both the reins, she gave a sudden powerful jerk at the right one, wrapped about her hand. Instantly sawing no less stoutly at the other, she felt the bit give back into its place against the tender portion of the creature's jaw, which was then subjected to the splendid strength that the moment lent to her arms and body. She was sawing him back to another thought than that of wild stampede, with impatience that bled him at the mouth as they dashed less swiftly toward the junction. More cries ahead were mingled with the distant shouting at the rear. The driveway of fashion began to clog with vehicles halted in confusion and affright. Then, up from the rear, shot the rider who had headed all but Thurley's thoroughbred. He, too, rode superbly, and was mounted on a powerful black, a bluegrass product of the racing blood, without a peer in the city. Nevertheless, when the rider's hand projected forward at the last and clutched Thurley's horse by the bit, she had already calmed his raging fire, and had pulled him down to sideways locomotion. The group swung sharply inward to the left, and Thurley's bay, resentful of the needless interference, flung outward again to the right. The saddle, loosened by the strain and pressure of the race, turned from the change of Thurley's momentum, and threw her easily off on her side in the gravel. She was neither bruised nor scratched, but groans and cries arose from the breathless audience in the halted procession on the drive. Policemen and the others, distanced in the mad pursuit, rode hotly to the scene, even as Thurley sprang to her feet and took her horse in hand. The only man who had ridden with sufficient speed to be in at the crucial moment had dismounted. He was young, smooth-shaven, and ruddy. He had snatched off his cap and was soberly regarding the wondrous surge of colour returning to Thurley's cheeks, when another man came running there from the drive's congested traffic. It was Stuyvesant, white and excited. "Princess!" he cried. Thurley turned, beheld him, and flushed to the tips of her ears. "Here, give me that horse," said one of the mounted policemen, now on foot beside the others. "The young lady might have been killed." "Oh, nonsense," said Thurley. "He's calm enough now, if someone will please adjust the saddle." "Are you hurt?" said Stuyvesant, crowding to her side. "Is there anything I can do?" James, other riders, and a dozen men, together with added numbers of policemen, arrived there in all manner of haste. Thurley foresaw an interference and annoyance. She turned to Stuyvesant gladly, as to one she felt she knew. "I'm not even scratched," she told him in her spirited manner. "He was stopping. He's not excited now. If the saddle hadn't turned, there would be no need for any one to help." The rider, who had caught at her horse's bit, at last reddened more deeply beneath the suntan of his face. "I'm sorry if you think I interfered. Was the cause—" "You were very kind," said Thurley radiantly, her smile restoring his exaltation in the moment. "Perhaps if you'll help me now to— Oh, here is James. The saddle, James. Will you please put it on a little tighter?" "Look here, miss," said the policeman, who was holding his own fine animal as well as the quivering bay, "I don't want to make you no trouble nor nothing like that, but this horse here is excited. He ain't fit for no lady to ride." He, too, received a smile. "You wouldn't arrest him for a little run like that?" "If you please, I think I know him best." "I give you my word he'll behave." Stuyvesant longed for the use of his injured arm. He thought of another expedient. "You wouldn't think of riding him again, not this morning," he said, hopelessly convinced that the girl of Thurley's spirit would think of nothing else. "Let me offer to take you home. The carriage is here." James was adjusting the saddle stolidly. The rider, who had all but effected a rescue, fancied he read the one desire in Thurley's courageous nature. "The horse was under control entirely," he said. "I'm sorry I interfered." He was not. He was riotously glad. "I'm sure the lady may be trusted to ride him safely home." "Well, now, I don't know," said the officer. "No, no," said the man in the gathering crowd. "It's madness, a beast like that." Thurley had heard only the man who had ridden to her side and helped to dislodge her from her seat. She turned to him appealingly. "Not home. I'd rather not go home just yet. I do wish people wouldn't act so seriously. Please help me go on as I was." Stuyvesant was desperate. The policeman was afraid of troubles that might still develop. "You see, miss," he started above the murmur and protest of the crowd, "a horse like this—" "Here, officer," muttered the ruddy young rider of the black, slipping a bill into the big, hard hand of the law's representative, "just scatter the crowd. With a dozen of you chaps watching him now, the horse can do no harm." He saw that James had concluded the readjustment of the saddle. "May I assist you up?" he added to Thurley, offering his card. "It's the least I can do after helping to bring you down." Thurley smiled her acceptance of the offer and received the card. Already the policemen were moving back the crowd and heading other horsemen from the scene. A number of those who were nearest the path saw Thurley once more mounted on her throne. Stuyvesant pressed in once again and halted in front of the restless horse, looking up beseechingly. "May I not see you soon?" he said. "If I hadn't been crippled like this." Thurley looked down at his upturned face with glory and mischief burning together in her eyes. "If you can find me, yes." She did not know that he had recognized her man. Then James released the thoroughbred, and she galloped quietly away. Chapter 9